The Metroid series is one that I've always wanted to give a fair shake, but never gave the time of day. This was mostly due to me not being a big Metroid guy for the longest time. I played through Fusion a few years back, but otherwise I found the games a bit overwhelming. With the release of Metroid Prime Remastered, however, that all changed. I never quite understood the appeal of a Metroidvania before playing this one. Even having played Fusion, a game I did really enjoy, I don't remember thinking anything in particular of it as far as Metroidvanias go. Of course, my lack of critical thinking was even worse back then, but that's besides the point. The first hour or two of Prime was a real eye-opener for me. Everything is so tightly designed while still opening up enough to not feel cramped. There's not a whole lot of hand-holding either, unless you spend long enough wandering about not making any progress, then the game will just straight up tell you where you need to go. The progression here made the game super addicting for me for the opening hours, and that satisfaction of getting a new upgrade and already knowing where you gotta go next. Unfortunately, I feel like as the game goes on, it does get worse about your next direction being somewhat unclear. Since starting Prime, I've played about an hour of Super Metroid and have finished Dread, and I feel like those games did a much better job of designing areas perfectly so that when you obtain a new major upgrade, you'll also immediately know where you need to use it. With Prime, you've got to do a lot more searching and sifting through the map to find a new door you can open with your fancy new beam, and at a certain point, I just started getting really tired of it. It's not so bad initially because there's only 2 areas you have to explore, but when Phendrana Drifts opens up, it feels as though every other second the game expects you to backtrack there, which means going all the way back through Magma Caverns to get there, which gets really tiresome. I get why there's no super convenient fast travel option, but I can't say that exploration is one of the game's stronger aspects when half the time I was left circling the entire map like a chicken with its head cut off because of how easy it can be to pass by upgrades and have to circle back around to them. There are times when I can admit I was just being stupid, but discovering the underwater area, making a bit of progress there, then having to go all the way back to Phendrana Drifts for the 3rd time to get the gravity suit, that just wasn't fun. Credit where credit is due, the game works a lot better as a 3D Metroidvania than I would have expected, and I still had a lot of fun with it, but if exploration was made just a bit more straightforward by having an elevator to each major area and the landing site, I would have enjoyed my time with it so much more. I'm definitely curious to check out the other Prime games now though. I can only assume there are plans for remastering 2 and 3 before 4 if that game ever gets properly revealed again. Maybe someday. Metroid Prime Remastered opened the door of curiosity to a whole new series for me to check out, and thanks to that, I love Metroid now, I guess. Before I even played Prime Remastered though, I at least wanted to see what the original game was like. NES Troid is a lot more daunting to me than some of the other entries as it barely guides you on where to go. This is the nature of the game though, as you explore to find new upgrades for your weapons, health and such to then be able to progress further in areas you previously weren't able to. One major downside is that there's no map. Now I don't know if this was due to any sort of limitations thanks to the hardware or maybe memory constraints, but for the time I could easily see the frustration this could have caused as it's a bit unclear at first what certain items do. I already knew some of the basics like how certain doors can only be opened using missiles, but there's a lot of trial and error involved in learning the basic mechanics. Many got around the lack of a map by drawing their own maps. Perhaps this is what Nintendo was hoping for, and honestly, I can't really dunk on that. If people find that fun, then more power to them. Personally though, I think growing up with modern gaming conveniences has made me more impatient with stuff like this because it makes the game somewhat of a chore to play. I went ahead and looked up a map for the game, and I'll admit, having it right in front of me did immediately make the game a bit more enjoyable, sorta how I felt when playing Super. Figuring out a path to go down is fun, but actually enacting that plan kinda sets in the mood for the rest of the game. It's pretty frustrating trying to navigate through each screen. Believe me, I tried to have fun here, but going from one side of the map to the other with very little change in gameplay except for bigger clusters of annoying enemies just isn't for me. I can't blame the game entirely for this, considering it was on the NES they were doing the best they could, and I don't think it's a bad game because of that. I think there are some qualities here. For one, it's really satisfying collecting new power-ups for your weapons, and especially getting upgrades to your health so that I could actually walk more than 100 feet without dying. I can see how satisfying progression could get as I go on, but forgive me if I sound ignorant when I say this, but the game feels like a massive fetch quest. I know how that might sound, and I really don't want to give off the wrong idea here, but this game is only as fun as the map design is, considering you have to traverse through some of the areas multiple times due to backtracking. lacking. Problem is that I just don't find the map design fun or interesting. The process of plotting my path is fun, but I can't get too interested in sinking a ton of time in this game, knowing it doesn't get a whole lot better from what I've heard, especially learning enemy patterns and such. Man, the enemies can slow you down so much, it makes them super irritating. I think the worst enemies are these dudes that fly across the screen, because in any room I found them in, they were almost always paired with the ceiling moth things, and they always dealt a ton of damage to me unless I got super lucky with the timing of my jumps. That's about everything I really want to say about NES Troid. It's not a bad game, I just can't say I enjoyed my time with it. For those who grew up with it, sure, I could see why this might be a fun game, even for some newer Metroid fans. There's a lot of fun that can come with the sense of discovery this game can give you, especially given that the game never tells you where to go or what to do. But there's also an argument for starting with a newer Metroid game and going back to the original, because you start to miss some of the conveniences you had, and it generally makes NES Troid a less pleasant experience overall. The later Metroid games do a great job improving on almost every aspect of the foundation that NES Troid laid down, and for that I can say I appreciate it a lot more than I did before, but I don't think I want to keep playing this. At some point maybe I'll revisit it, but Zero Mission is right there, so I don't think it'll be anytime soon. Speaking of, Zero Mission is unequivocally a massive step up from NES Troid. Movement is faster, which is an immediate plus. The game also has a built-in map and guides you much more clearly with waypoint markers, and just those few changes and additions are huge and make the original Metroid far more enjoyable. I do still think there's something to be said about charting out your own maps for NES Troid being fun, however I can't lie and say that the convenience an in-game map brings makes me want to go back to the original's limitations. Platforming still feels a tad stiff, although I'm kinda used to it after having played Fusion. I do feel like I got a lot more upgrades in the opening hour of the game than in NES Troid, though that may be due to Zero Mission's much easier navigation. There's far less mindless wandering going on here. Although I don't know if I understand why grabbing ledges is an ability you need to unlock. That's like if you had to unlock jumping. Just feels kinda silly given that you have it from the get-go in Fusion. I don't have much else to comment on here. Zero Mission is a great remake that does exactly what it should and nothing less. If you couldn't get into the original, I'd highly recommend giving Zero Mission a shot. And how could I make this video without at least mentioning Fusion? After all, it is the first 2D Metroid I ever played. Replaying it is an interesting experience. Slightly tedious thanks to the heavier amount of dialogue compared to other entries, and it really doesn't leave a whole lot of room for exploration. In fact, oftentimes it'll flat out block off certain areas just to make sure you don't veer off the beaten path. It's probably the most linear 2D Metroid from what I've played. No other game in the series is quite as blatant about its linearity as Fusion is, although I don't think the lack of exploration hindered my experience, but it does leave me feeling a bit iffy about it these days. Fusion is still a good game with some solid level design, but I can't help but feel like its potential is limited. I don't feel like it has as much replay value as really any of the other games because of how linear it is. The aesthetic and antagonist are top-notch though. SAX is far from being as creepy as I thought it was when I was younger, but it's still a really cool idea for the antagonist of the game, the X-Parasites, which essentially copy and steal creatures' bodies to steal Samus's body. I feel like this game justifies Samus losing her abilities the best because of that. In some of the other games, she could stub her toe and just lose everything. Also, I love Samus's suit design in this game. It's easily my second favorite, just behind the Dread suit. I've been replaying Fusion through Game Boy Advance Online, and I have to say that the colors really pop here. From what I remember of the Wii U's emulators, some of them had issues with displaying washed out colors or having really low brightness for whatever reason, and here it's a lot more accurate, which I love. I just love how this game looks. It'd be really interesting to see how they would adapt it for a remake like Samus Returns. The added depth of 3D environments could be used to change the tone to feel darker, which could be really cool. Overall though, Fusion left me feeling a little iffy due to its lesser focus on exploration. One of the most important aspects of the series is the progression, gaining those new abilities and feeling more powerful, more capable, and being able to explore new areas that you couldn't before. Fusion, thanks to its linearity, kinda lacks that satisfying feeling, at least personally speaking. I had fun with it despite that, so I would still highly recommend the game to anyone interested, but replaying it has just opened my eyes a bit. Before closing out, I'd like to talk about one more Metroid game, the one that really cemented my newfound love for the series. One that I had planned on playing much sooner, but never got around to until this year, and man was I missing out. Of course, I'm talking about Metroid Prime Pinball. Of course, I'm talking about Metroid Dread. This freaking game, dude, I barely ever get so hooked to a game like I did with Dread, but man, this game is awesome. Movement and combat feels the best it ever has, taking a lot of notes from Samus Returns with the returning melee counter and follow-up dash, which is super satisfying to pull off. The game is so buttery smooth to play, and gorgeous too. There's also a bigger emphasis on bosses, Dread having probably the most bosses in the series if you count mini-bosses. Honestly, I got kind of annoyed with just how many there were, and they really don't hold back either. The robot Chozo soldiers kicked my butt, as did many of the others. The regular Chozo soldiers though, I didn't mind having to fight these guys multiple times, as they're really fun and have easy to learn attack patterns. Also, considering the counterattack cinematics, these guys have some of the best and coolest ones. And the bigger bosses were all equally really fun. Honestly, I don't know if I can pick a favorite, maybe the final boss? No spoilers, but that thing, while tough and somewhat annoying to learn, was the best way you could cap off the experience, testing your knowledge with the abilities, and just being super raw. Ability progression is solid as well, although I found it interesting how instead of giving you the morph ball and bomb early on like most of the other games do, Dread instead holds them back like a carrot on a stick over your head for a good portion of the game. I kinda like the mix-up though, makes for a good change of pace. There's also a couple of new abilities, mainly pertaining to a new major enemy in the game, the Emmy. Throughout the game, you'll pass through areas called Emmy Zones, which these surveillance robots explore. Issue is, if caught by one, you're insta-killed. This is where your knowledge of the abilities and movement is put to the test, because if they see you, they'll give chase and lock down the zone, meaning you'll have to lose them by hiding. This becomes somewhat easier with one of the new abilities, the Phantom Cloak, which hides you in plain sight, making the Emmy unable to see you. I thought the Emmy was a really cool idea at first, and I still think they're fun to sneak around, however, they progressively get more annoying as the game goes on. Each one is able to detect you from a further distance than the last, with the blue Emmy, I believe, being the absolute most obnoxious one because of this. You seriously can't move an inch without the thing instantly detecting you, which only made it a teensy little itty bit frustrating. I totally didn't spend over half an hour trying to get past it, no siree. At least they give you the Omega Cannon, which lets you absolutely obliterate these things, and believe me, getting to vaporize the blue Emmy after the frustration it caused me was an incomparable kind of satisfaction. To me, Dread feels a little more linear than NES Troid, but less so than Fusion. Like I said earlier, I think Fusion was a little too drastic with its linearity, locking off certain areas at points so you can't backtrack. Dread does something similar at a handful of points, but I never felt like it was anywhere near the extent of Fusion. For most of the game, you're led down a straightforward path, however, I felt like that changed a little over midway through the game, leaving you more to explore on your own. And on my first playthrough, I found this really confusing and often got lost, but I'm willing to attribute that to the fact that it's the first 2D Metroid I've finished playing since Fusion years ago. I'm not as familiar with many of the level design decisions that may be consistent between games, so I likely just missed some cues here and there. And none of that stopped the game from being super addicting though. I stayed hooked to it despite how it felt like things were dragging out a little. It's kinda weird, I have my issues with the pacing, but the rest of the game is so solid that I just don't care. It's funny how the lack of direction in the latter half didn't bother me as much in this game, but in Prime it pretty well soured the experience. I think that's because Dread is such a strong return in just about every aspect for a series that hadn't seen an all-new game in nearly 2 decades, leaving me with the question, why did it take so long for us to get here? Purely a rhetorical question, cause I already know the answer. Unfortunately, the Metroid series has never sold all that well in comparison to Nintendo's other franchises. Even Dread, despite being the best-selling game in the series, only sold 2.9 million copies by May of 2022. To be clear, that's not bad. It's great that Dread sold the best, but looking at any other long-lasting Nintendo franchise's sales numbers will make Dread's 2.9 million look kinda small in comparison. Regardless, I'm hopeful that Dread selling so much better than its predecessors means that the 2D games are back on the map for getting new games more often rather than lying dormant for over a decade. I haven't been a Metroid fan for too long, but I can't imagine the pain Metroid fans have been through waiting for new 2D Metroids, much less Metroid games in general. Here's hoping for a brighter future though. Prime 4 may still be a ways off, but I guess there's a benefit in me becoming a Metroid fan now. I still have plenty more of the games to play to tide me over until then. If you haven't played the games and are are interested but don't know where to jump in, I'd say Dread or Fusion are probably the best, so long as you're not playing the games for the story. Chronologically, it's the worst place to start for the 2D games, so if story is a concern, start with Zero Mission, then Samus Returns, Super, Fusion, and Dread. If you do decide to try out the games, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them as well. I never saw myself becoming a Metroid fan because of their daunting nature, however, playing them now made me realize they're not so confusing after all, and now the series has quickly become one of my new favorites. I've still got a fair few of the games to play, so for now, I've been Wyrlwind, and thanks for watching.